How is it that a game I started 1.5 years ago has less features now than when I started? Well, let me tell you about my journey trying to create my indie game, Sundowner. So, what is Sundowner? Sundowner is my current game development project, and well, to put it simply, it's the face punch game Rust, but in VR. While I don't want the end product to simply be a clone, it basically is Rust but VR. I have a gross number of hours in the game too, over 2,000, and I realized there wasn't a VR version of it. So one day, I decided to boot up my favorite game engine, Unity, and I started working on a prototype. And after a week of development, I had this to show for it. It didn't require much effort to get going. I learned the basics of getting a VR player set up in Unity from Justin P. Barnett. And for the rest, I pulled from a map generation script I had already copied from Sebastian Legoo, and then I had some scripts that detected when the trees and rocks were hit by tools. Afterwards, I continued working on things, first adding inventory and crafting, and eventually, I even got base building working. Things were going smoothly, and I was pretty motivated to continue working. I even got basic multiplayer working. But there was something missing. If you pay attention to the hands, you can notice something. They don't actually grip the tools. Floating hands in VR is pretty common, but something that isn't acceptable is not grabbing the objects, and I didn't want to do the system myself. So, as any sensible solo developer would do, I checked the asset store. And after trying a few, I landed on a good system, Hurricane VR. It looked nice, it felt nice, and so I got it. These are one of the few problems that made me lose so much progress. I am a victim of ADHD, and that generally means as soon as a task becomes inconvenient, hard, or uninteresting, it suddenly becomes pretty hard to get much done. Switching systems meant I had to start over with everything else, from multiplayer to base building, and I would have to remake it all. So to avoid that, I focused on something a little more fun, the procedural generation. For a while now, the game had very basic procedural generation, and honestly it was horrible. The system basically went through every vertex on the ground and placed an object randomly around it. This worked, but didn't look right. So I noticed how someone else achieved the random placement using raycast from the sky, and it achieved way better results. While my ultimate goal is to have a way better system with forests, clusters, and biomes, this worked enough, and while working on this, I implemented better grass. Unfortunately, life got in the way of my game development. In early 2022, I went through a breakup with my partner and had to take a break from work on Sundowner. However, after a month, I picked myself back up and decided to pivot the direction of the game towards something more like Tarkov. This is another slowdown. This led to me creating some pretty cool weapon mechanics though, such as loading magazines, loading the chamber with individual bullets, and even realistic bullet physics. The problem is, that wasn't the original view of the game, and by this point I was so off track that working on the game felt impossible. I spent the rest of the summer and most of the fall not doing much, and instead I tried to focus on school and work. This led to a complete shutdown of development, and while I tried to get back into it, my session of Unity would usually go the following. I open up Unity, I stare at the screen, think, wow, this is a mess. And then I'll open YouTube and watch videos and close the editor after like an hour. I did do a few cool things, such as mess around with the idea of a VR Metal Gear Solid, which I may explore further. As I mentioned, I took a break from working on Sundowner during the fall, and instead I focused on making a Tarkov-inspired game using Gmod. I eventually posted some short-form content to promote it, but my interest eventually shifted back to Unity. In early December, I got back into Unity by working on a proof of concept for a Metal Gear Online game. And although I made it only as far as making a third-person controller, it was refreshing to be able to test things without needing to put on the VR headset every time. And so let's get back to the main game, Sundowner though. After visiting family for a couple weeks at the end of the year, I made it my resolution to continue working on the game, and shockingly, I did just that. It was a slow process, but I eventually got back into it. And that leads to today. The game currently has less features than the peak. but it is better now than it was at that peak. When the game had more features, they were a mix of half-functioning mechanics with code that was a horrible mess. First, I got started with some edits to the procedural generation again. I wanted to deform the ground to accommodate large structures. And while I don't plan on copying Rust monuments, it's a lot more fun when a map has places to loot. So, I researched how to deform the mesh, and I even used my friend ChatGPT to help me out. And here's the problem with ChatGPT, it doesn't really give you the right code, but it points you in the right direction. And finally, after a few bugs, I got it working. Now, you have to harvest resources in the game, so the next step was dealing with everyone's least favorite mechanic, farming. It didn't require much effort to get going, and so by the end of the day, I implemented many of the parts required to get working. The next day had me in for a shock though. After doing some research, I was surprised to find out that 9 months prior, a YouTuber named Drew Mileham had started his own project for a Rust-like game called Strayed. The news initially hit me like a truck and left me feeling pretty bad. But after the initial shock, it provided me with some motivation that I needed to work harder. And as it turns out, the lack of competition reduced the urgency for me to complete the project. Sundowner is a game I've been working on for a while now. And despite numerous challenges along the way, I'm still committed to bringing this game to life to fill the void of a Rust-like VR game. And as development continues, I hope you guys will follow me in my journey in completing the game. Thanks for watching.